Karl Marx's philosophy begins with the recognition that human beings are creative, social, and purposeful by nature, yet under capitalism, this nature is systematically distorted. His concept of alienation describes the estrangement of human beings from their labor, from the products they create, from each other, and ultimately from themselves. This is not merely a psychological problem, but a structural condition arising from the economic organization of society. In a pre-capitalist world, labor was often tied to survival and community, but in capitalism, labor becomes commodified. The worker sells labor power as if it were a product on the market, transforming human creativity into an object of exchange. The result is that work ceases to be an expression of human potential and becomes instead a forced activity performed under the domination of capital. Alienation emerges because the worker no longer recognizes themselves in what they produce. The product belongs not to them, but to the capitalist who appropriates it, and so the worker's labor becomes something external and hostile to their own existence. This alienation extends beyond the immediate act of production. Because labor is commodified, the worker's very life is subordinated to economic necessity. Marx emphasizes that humans should be able to see their own freedom in their creative activity, yet in capitalism, they experience labor as constraint. Work is endured only for the wage, and leisure becomes the mere recovery from labor, rather than the flourishing of human capacities. In this sense, alienation impoverishes human life, not simply materially, but existentially. Alienation also structures social relationships. Workers compete with one another for scarce jobs, for higher wages, for survival. Instead of cooperation and mutual recognition, there is rivalry and mistrust. Society becomes fragmented, and human beings see each other not as fellow participants in collective life, but as obstacles or tools. Marx's philosophy insists that alienation is not merely about individual dissatisfaction, but about the breakdown of authentic human community under the logic of capital. Perhaps the deepest form of alienation is self-alienation. Humans, Marx argues, are by nature species beings, meaning they're capable of conscious, collective, and creative activity. They can shape their environment and themselves with awareness. But under capitalism, this potential is denied. Labor is reduced to mechanical repetition, creativity is subordinated to profit, and consciousness is shaped by the ideology of the ruling class. The worker becomes estranged from their own human essence, unable to live as the free, creative being they have the potential to be. Marx's philosophy of alienation is not a mere lament, but a diagnosis of the structure of capitalism. He does not present alienation as an eternal condition of humanity, but as a specific result of a particular economic system. This means alienation can be overcome, not by reforming work within capitalism, but by transforming the system itself. To abolish alienation requires abolishing private ownership of the means of production and reorganizing labor so that it becomes a direct expression of human freedom. In this way, alienation forms the foundation of Marxist critique. It shows that capitalism is not simply inefficient or unequal, but fundamentally inhuman. It takes the very essence of human life, creative labor, and turns it into a commodity, severing the connection between individuals and their own potential. Marx's philosophy begins with this recognition, and from here, he builds the larger framework of historical materialism and class struggle. Marx's philosophy of history is built on what he called historical materialism, The view that the development of human societies is driven primarily by material conditions and the organization of production, rather than by abstract ideas or individual heroes. This perspective shifts the focus of philosophy from speculation about human nature or divine will to the concrete realities of how people produce and reproduce their lives. In this sense, Marx declares that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their social being that determines their consciousness.
History, then, is a series of stages defined by particular modes of production: primitive communism, ancient slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and beyond. Each mode is characterized by a specific relationship between classes, with one class exploiting the labor of another. In feudalism, the lord extracts surplus from the serf. In capitalism, the capitalist extracts surplus value from the worker. These relations are not static. They contain contradictions that generate conflict, and it is this conflict that propels history forward. The mechanism of historical change, according to Marx, is class struggle. The exploited class resists domination, and eventually the tension between the forces of production, the technological and productive capacities of society, and the relations of production, the social structures that govern them, produces a rupture. When the old relations become a fetter on further development, revolution occurs and a new mode of production emerges. Thus, history is not a smooth progression, but a series of ruptures born of conflict. Marx's historical materialism also critiques the idealist notion that history is shaped by great individuals or ideas alone. While acknowledging that individuals play a role, Marx insists that they do so only within the material conditions given to them. Napoleon, for example, could only rise in a Europe already transformed by the French Revolution and the decline of feudal aristocracy. Ideas such as liberty, equality, or fraternity gain traction not because they exist in abstraction, but because they resonate with the material struggles of their time. This framework also reveals the ideological function of ruling ideas. In every era, the ruling class not only dominates materially, but also ideologically, presenting its interests as universal truths. Under capitalism, ideas such as private property, free markets, and individual responsibility appear natural and eternal, when in fact they are historically specific. Historical materialism exposes these ideas as products of a particular economic structure rather than timeless realities. The significance of Marx's historical materialism lies in its radical reorientation of philosophy. Instead of treating history as a narrative of kings and thinkers, it treats it as the story of how human beings collectively organize their material existence. It grounds philosophy in lived reality, insisting that to understand human society, one must understand labor, production, and class. Historical materialism carries an emancipatory implication. If history is shaped by material conditions and class struggle, then the future is not fixed. By changing the relations of production, by overthrowing exploitation, humanity can reshape its destiny. This breaks with the fatalism of both religious providence and deterministic philosophy. Marx's framework insists that while conditions constrain, they do not dictate absolutely. Human beings, through collective struggle, make their own history, though never under conditions of their own choosing. Thus, historical materialism provides the scaffolding for Marx's entire philosophy. It explains alienation as a product of capitalist relations. It explains ideology as the reflection of class power. And it explains revolution as the necessary outcome of contradictions within production. It is not merely a theory of history, but a method of analysis that reveals the roots of social reality in the material life of human beings. At the core of Marx's philosophy lies the recognition that human society has always been divided into classes. These classes are not arbitrary groupings, but they are defined by their relation to the means of production, who owns them, and who must labor upon them. This structural division is the axis around which history turns, and it is the source of the conflict that drives change. For Marx, exploitation is not simply the result of cruelty, greed, or individual vice. It is systemic. In every class society, one class extracts surplus labor from another. In slavery, the master owns the slave and the product of the slave's labor. In feudalism, the serf works the land and the lord appropriates the surplus through rents and dues. In capitalism, exploitation takes a subtler form. The worker is legally free, but because they do not own the means of production, they must sell their labor power to survive. The capitalist pays the worker a wage, yet the value the worker produces in a day always exceeds the wage. The difference, known as surplus value, is appropriated by the capitalist. Exploitation, therefore, is hidden beneath the appearance of fairness.
This dynamic reveals one of Marx's most profound insights. Under capitalism, exploitation is veiled by the market. Unlike the whip of the slave master or the dues of the feudal lord, capitalist exploitation appears voluntary. Worker and capitalist meet in the marketplace as equals, exchanging labor for wages. Yet beneath this equality lies a profound asymmetry. The capitalist controls the means of life itself, forcing the worker into dependency. The freedom of the worker is the freedom to starve or to sell labor under conditions dictated by capital. Marx emphasizes that this relationship is not accidental, but inherent to capitalism. Without surplus value, profit would vanish, and with it the entire system. Thus, exploitation is not a moral flaw that can be corrected by better employers or more ethical markets. It is the very engine of the system, the mechanism by which capital expands. Class struggle arises inevitably from this contradiction. Workers, compelled to sell their labor cheaply, resist through strikes, unions, and demands for higher wages. Capitalists, seeking to maximize profit, resist these demands, driving down wages, lengthening working hours, and intensifying production. This antagonism is not personal, it is structural. No matter how benevolent an individual capitalist may be, they must compete in the market, and competition forces them to exploit. Likewise, no matter how submissive workers may seem, their very condition of exploitation plants the seeds of resistance. Marx insists that class struggle is not limited to economics. It permeates politics, culture, and ideology. The state, for example, presents itself as neutral, but in reality functions as the executive committee of the ruling class. Laws that protect private property, suppress strikes, or regulate trade are not arbitrary. They reflect the interests of capital. Similarly, dominant cultural values often reinforce class hierarchies by glorifying wealth, stigmatizing poverty, and portraying social order as natural. Even morality and religion can function as tools of class rule, consoling the oppressed while legitimizing the system that oppresses them. The implications of this analysis are revolutionary. If exploitation is systemic,
then no reform can fully abolish it. Higher wages, better working conditions, or social programs may soften the edges of exploitation, but they do not eliminate its root, the private ownership of the means of production. As long as capital exists, the capitalist must extract surplus. And as long as surplus is extracted, class struggle will continue. Marx therefore frames class struggle not as an unfortunate byproduct of capitalism, but as its defining feature. Capitalism cannot exist without it, and it is through this struggle that capitalism will eventually be overthrown. Workers, united by their shared exploitation, form the proletariat, a class with both the capacity and the interest to abolish the system altogether. In doing so, they will not merely replace one ruling class with another, as in past revolutions, but will create a classless society where production is organized for human need rather than profit. Marx's concept of alienation is one of his most penetrating contributions to philosophy. It captures not only the economic mechanics of capitalism, but also its deep existential and psychological effects on human beings. To understand alienation is to understand how the very structure of capitalist labor estranges individuals from their essence, from their creativity, and from one another. For Marx, humans are not merely biological organisms. They are beings who transform nature consciously through labor. Labor, in its truest form, is creative activity, the expression of human powers in the world. To build, to cultivate, to imagine, to shape materials into tools, art, or institutions, this is the essence of what it means to be human. In pre-capitalist forms of labor, though often constrained by necessity, there still existed a more direct relationship between the worker and their product. The artisan, for example, saw in the crafted object the expression of their skill and individuality. The peasant, while bound to the soil, could see the fruits of their work as tied to their survival and community.
Capitalism, however, fundamentally disrupts this relationship. Under capitalism, the worker does not own what they produce. The product of labor belongs to the capitalist, who appropriates it as part of the process of capital accumulation. The worker's activity becomes a means to someone else's end. The result is alienation from the product of labor. What the worker creates confronts them not as an expression of their being, but as an alien object, controlled and sold by another. Alienation extends further. The worker is estranged not only from the product, but from the process of labor itself. Work ceases to be an expression of life and becomes drudgery. Instead of being an activity through which humans affirm themselves, labor under capitalism is coerced, repetitive, and imposed. Workers labor not because they freely choose to, but because they must in order to survive. Labor becomes external to the worker, something endured rather than embraced. This alienation deepens into estrangement from one's own species being, a term Marx uses to describe the essence of humanity as a conscious, social, and creative species. Under capitalism, the worker's capacities are stunted. Instead of cultivating creativity, imagination, and collaboration, labor is reduced to a narrowly defined role within the machinery of production. The worker becomes a cog, valued only for the capacity to produce surplus value. The rich multiplicity of human potential is sacrificed to the demands of capital. Alienation also poisons social relations. When labor is commodified, human interactions are mediated by exchange value. Instead of relating to each other as free beings, people confront one another as buyers and sellers, as competitors in the labor market. The solidarity that could arise from shared humanity is eroded by the logic of competition and individual survival. In this sense, capitalism does not simply exploit labor, but corrodes the very bonds of community.
What makes Marx's theory of alienation so compelling is its dual dimension. On the one hand, it is an economic diagnosis. It explains how the ownership structure of capitalism estranges workers from the products and processes of their labor. On the other hand, it is an existential diagnosis. It reveals how capitalism distorts the deepest human capacities, turning life into survival, creativity into drudgery, and solidarity into competition. It is not just the body that is exploited under capitalism, but the soul. Alienation is not, however, an eternal condition. It is specific to a society where labor is subordinated to capital. In a communist society, where workers collectively control the means of production, labor would no longer be forced, but freely associated. Work would regain its status as a creative and fulfilling activity, integrated with the development of human capacities. Products would no longer confront workers as alien objects, but as the shared results of communal activity. Relations among individuals would shift from competition to cooperation, restoring the bonds of human solidarity. Marx's analysis of alienation remains strikingly relevant in the modern world. In an era of mass production, precarious labor, and digital gig economies, many workers still experience their jobs as meaningless, repetitive, and disconnected from their true abilities. Even as technology promises liberation, the structure of capitalism ensures that labor continues to dominate life rather than free it. The sense of emptiness and disconnection that so many experience is not accidental, but symptomatic of the alienation Marx described. The philosophy of alienation reveals the profound human stakes of Marxist critique. Capitalism does not only shape economies and politics, it shapes souls. It reshapes what it means to live as a human being. To overcome alienation is not merely to redistribute wealth, but to reclaim humanity itself, to restore labor as a joyful and self-affirming activity, and to rebuild society on the basis of human flourishing rather than profit. Marx's philosophy is not limited to the material mechanics of production, but extends into the realm of thought itself. He argues that the ruling ideas of any epoch are the ideas of its ruling class. This is not accidental. Ideas, values, and beliefs are shaped by material conditions, and in a class society, they reflect the interests of the dominant class. This leads to one of Marx's most powerful insights: ideology. Ideology, for Marx, is not simply propaganda or deliberate lies, though that can be part of it. It is a system of ideas that makes the existing social order appear natural, inevitable, and just. Ideology is powerful precisely because it doesn't feel imposed from above. It feels like common sense. It shapes how people perceive themselves, their relationships, and the world. It normalizes inequality and masks exploitation. Take capitalism as an example. Its ideological core presents the market as a realm of freedom. Workers and employers meet as equals, exchanging labor for wages. Success is framed as the result of hard work and talent, while poverty is seen as personal failure. These ideas obscure the structural reality. Workers must sell labor to survive. Capitalists extract surplus value, and inequality is systemic. By framing exploitation as freedom and poverty as a personal flaw, ideology keeps workers from recognizing their collective condition. This is where the concept of false consciousness arises. Workers may internalize the dominant ideology and fail to see the system for what it is. They may believe that their interests align with those of their employers, or that their poverty is due to laziness rather than structural exploitation. False consciousness does not mean people are stupid or incapable of critical thought. It means their lived experience is filtered through the lens of ruling ideas. Ideology acts like a veil, distorting perception so that systemic contradictions appear invisible or natural. Marx does not view ideology as a conspiracy of the ruling class, though the ruling class certainly benefits from it. Instead, it emerges organically from the material conditions of society. When capital dominates life, the ideas that justify capital also dominate. This is why the media, education, religion, and even philosophy often reproduce ruling class values. They do not simply reflect reality, they shape how reality is understood. The task of revolutionary philosophy, then, is to pierce through ideology and expose the underlying structures of exploitation. Class consciousness arises when workers recognize that their struggles are not isolated, but shared, and that the ruling ideas serve to keep them divided. To move from false consciousness to class consciousness is to see society not as a collection of individuals, but as a system of relations rooted in class. The importance of ideology also explains why revolutions are not purely economic. Even when material conditions ripen, people must recognize their collective power and imagine alternatives. This requires a transformation in thought as well as in production. Ideology can persist even when material reality undermines it, making it one of the greatest obstacles to emancipation. Modern life demonstrates the enduring relevance of Marx's analysis. The ideology of consumerism, for instance, convinces people that fulfillment comes through buying commodities. Advertising creates desires and identities tied to consumption, making individuals believe they express themselves through brands and products. Meanwhile, the labor conditions behind these commodities are obscured. Similarly, neoliberal ideology frames privatization, deregulation, and austerity as rational necessities rather than political choices that benefit the wealthy. False consciousness also manifests in nationalism, racism, and other forms of division that fragment the working class. Instead of recognizing shared exploitation, workers may be led to identify with their nation, race, or religion against others. These divisions weaken collective resistance and maintain ruling class dominance. For Marx, ideology is not insurmountable. Just as it is produced by material conditions, it can be dismantled by changing those conditions and by fostering critical awareness. Education, agitation, and collective struggle help expose the contradictions between ideology and lived experience. When workers strike and realize their shared power, ideology begins to crack. When communities organize and resist, the ruling ideas lose their natural appearance. Marx's theory of ideology thus provides both a critique and a call to action. It explains why exploitation persists even when it is visible, and it emphasizes the necessity of consciousness in social transformation. To overthrow capitalism requires not only changing who controls production, but also dismantling the mental frameworks that justify exploitation. The liberation of thought is inseparable from the liberation of labor. Marx's philosophy is grounded in what he calls historical materialism, a method for understanding history not as a sequence of random events or the work of great individuals, but as the outcome of material conditions and class struggle. To grasp this fully is to see history itself as structured, patterned, and driven by forces that extend beyond the will of any one person.
At its core, historical materialism asserts that the mode of production, the way in which society organizes labor, technology, and resources, forms the foundation upon which politics, culture, and ideas are built. The economic base shapes the superstructure. This means that while human beings create art, laws, and philosophies,
These creations are never independent of the material conditions of life. The ruling ideas of any era reflect the material interests of the ruling class. For example, feudal society rested on agriculture tied to land ownership. The lord-serf relationship defined production. The political superstructure, monarchies, religious hierarchies, feudal law reflected this base. When capitalism emerged, with wage labor and private ownership of factories, it brought with it a new political form in the liberal state and new cultural forms like individualism and rationalism. Material shifts in production gave rise to shifts in thought and politics. Marx emphasizes that history is not static. Every mode of production contains contradictions that eventually undermine it. In feudalism, the growing development of trade and markets clashed with rigid feudal structures, paving the way for capitalism. In capitalism, the contradiction lies between social production and private appropriation. The wealth of society is created collectively by workers, but privately owned by capitalists. This contradiction drives crises, exploitation, and eventually the possibility of transformation. Historical materialism is not mechanical determinism. Marx does not claim that history unfolds automatically or predictably like clockwork. Rather, he insists that human beings make history, but not under conditions of their choosing. Material structures constrain action, but within those constraints, struggle and agency matter. Revolutions, for example, require not only material contradictions, but also conscious organization and political struggle. This method reframes how we think about progress. History is not a steady march toward freedom guided by moral improvement. It is a process shaped by conflict, crises, and ruptures. The French Revolution, for instance, was not simply the result of Enlightenment ideals, but the culmination of contradictions within feudalism, intensified by economic hardship and class struggle. Similarly, the potential for socialism arises not from abstract ideals of justice, but from the contradictions within capitalism itself. Historical materialism also challenges idealist philosophies that see ideas as the primary movers of history. For Marx, ideas do not exist in a vacuum. They are shaped by social life and serve particular interests. Even the most abstract philosophies often reflect the standpoint of a particular class. This does not mean ideas are unimportant, but their power must be understood in relation to material conditions. One of the strengths of this approach is its ability to explain both stability and change. Societies persist because ruling classes create institutions, ideologies, and coercive structures that stabilize their power. But contradictions within production generate instability that no ideology can permanently conceal. Crises, whether economic, political, or social, reveal the fragility of the system and create openings for transformation. Marx sees capitalism as a dynamic system. Unlike feudalism, which was relatively static, capitalism constantly revolutionizes the means of production. It unleashes technology, expands markets, and transforms life at a rapid pace. Yet this dynamism also produces instability. Overproduction, unemployment, and financial crises expose the contradictions between capital's drive for profit and the limited capacity of markets to absorb commodities. Historical materialism reveals that this very dynamism makes capitalism both powerful and self-destructive. The logic of change in Marx's framework is therefore dialectical. Each mode of production develops forces that eventually clash with its relations of production. When the contradiction becomes irreconcilable, social transformation occurs. The outcome is not predetermined. Struggle determines whether the contradiction leads to regression, reform, or revolution. But the pattern is consistent. Social systems contain the seeds of their own transformation. In this sense, historical materialism is both descriptive and prescriptive. It explains why past societies collapsed and points toward the potential collapse of capitalism. It suggests that the conditions for socialism are not utopian dreams, but the logical outcome of capitalism's development. The concentration of capital, the growth of the working class, and the intensification of crises all create the conditions for transformation.
What makes historical materialism a philosophy rather than just a method of social science is its insistence that human freedom depends on understanding these structures. To act effectively, we must grasp the material forces that shape our lives. Freedom is not found in abstract ideals, but in the collective transformation of material reality. To change the world, one must first understand how history actually works. For Marx, revolution is not a matter of moral outrage or the will of a small group of radicals. It is the necessary outcome of contradictions within society. Capitalism, by its very design, generates the conditions for its own overthrow. Revolution is the point where material contradictions, class struggle, and human agency converge. Marx insists that past revolutions, such as the overthrow of feudalism, were always partial. They replaced one ruling class with another. The bourgeoisie toppled the feudal aristocracy, but exploitation persisted under new forms. The capitalist class did not abolish inequality. It merely restructured it around wage labor and private ownership of capital. In contrast, the revolution envisioned by Marx is unique. The proletariat, being a class with no property of its own, has no interest in maintaining class divisions. Its liberation requires the abolition of all classes. The mechanics of revolution flow directly from the structure of capitalism. Capitalism concentrates workers into factories, cities, and networks of production. This concentration fosters solidarity and collective identity. At the same time, the system continually produces crises, unemployment, and inequality, creating conditions of instability. Workers begin by resisting exploitation through strikes and demands for reform. But these struggles can expand into broader challenges to the system itself. When workers recognize their shared condition, they develop class consciousness. With organization and political struggle, this consciousness can transform into revolutionary action. Marx does not romanticize revolution as spontaneous chaos. He emphasizes the need for organization, leadership, and a clear understanding of systemic dynamics. Without such direction, uprisings may flare up but quickly collapse or be co-opted. Revolutionary movements must build institutions capable of seizing and transforming state power. The state, Marx argues, is not neutral, but an instrument of class rule. Therefore, true revolution requires not merely capturing the state, but dismantling its role as an enforcer of class domination. The goal of revolution is not simply to redistribute wealth, but to fundamentally alter the relations of production. This means abolishing private ownership of the means of production and replacing it with collective ownership. Factories, land, and resources would no longer serve private profit, but communal need. Labor would be organized democratically, with workers themselves directing production. The distinction between exploited and exploiter would dissolve, for no class would exist to dominate another. Communism, in Marx's philosophy, is not a detailed blueprint of an ideal society. He deliberately avoids utopian speculation.
Instead, communism is the real movement that arises from the contradictions of capitalism. It is the practical resolution of alienation, exploitation, and inequality. It represents a society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. At the heart of this vision is the transformation of labor. Under capitalism, labor is coerced and alienated, a means to survival. In communism, labor would become self-affirming activity, an expression of creativity and collaboration. The division between work and life would diminish. Technology, freed from the constraints of profit, could reduce drudgery and expand leisure, allowing individuals to cultivate their capacities more fully. Revolution also entails a transformation of social relations. In a classless society, human beings would relate to one another not as commodities or competitors, but as collaborators. The market logic that reduces relationships to exchange would give way to solidarity and cooperation. Freedom would no longer be the freedom to compete, but the freedom to flourish collectively. Marx acknowledges that the path to communism would not be immediate or smooth. The transition would involve a period of what he calls the dictatorship of the proletariat, where workers suppress counter-revolutionary forces and reorganize production on new foundations. This stage is not an end in itself, but a means of ensuring that old class structures do not reassert themselves. The ultimate goal is a stateless, classless society where coercion is unnecessary because exploitation has been abolished.
The revolutionary horizon of Marx's thought is both practical and deeply philosophical. It is practical in that it emerges from material contradictions that can be observed and analyzed. It is philosophical in that it envisions the emancipation of humanity from alienation, exploitation, and domination. Communism, in this sense, is not merely a new economic system, but the realization of human freedom, the reclamation of our species' being as creative, social, and self-determining. Even in the 21st century, when capitalism appears dominant, the revolutionary implications of Marxist philosophy remain potent. Crises of inequality, ecological devastation, and global instability revealed the limits of a system organized around profit. Marx's insistence that revolution is not only possible, but necessary, continues to resonate wherever people resist oppression and imagine a world beyond capital. One of Marx's most enduring contributions is his analysis of capitalism as a system riddled with contradictions that inevitably generate crises. Unlike classical economists, who praised capitalism as a harmonious order of supply and demand, Marx saw beneath its surface a structure driven by instability, excess, and conflict. Capitalism is dynamic, productive, and transformative, but precisely because of these qualities, it is also self-destructive. At the heart of Marx's crisis theory is the contradiction between social production and private appropriation. Wealth is created collectively. Millions of workers around the globe laboring in interconnected networks of production. Yet the fruits of this collective labor are privately owned by capitalists. This mismatch produces constant tension. The collective nature of production suggests that resources should be organized for the benefit of all, but private appropriation ensures that wealth is hoarded by a minority. A second contradiction lies between capital's drive for profit and the limited capacity of markets. Capitalists continually expand production, driven by competition to reduce costs and increase output. But workers, who are also consumers, are paid less than the value they produce. This creates a problem. The system generates more goods than the market can absorb.
Overproduction leads to crises, where warehouses overflow with unsold products, while workers starve because they cannot afford what they themselves produced. This contradiction explains why capitalism experiences cycles of boom and bust. Periods of expansion, when profits rise and investments flourish, are followed by crashes, layoffs, and recessions. These crises are not accidents caused by mismanagement. They are inherent to the system. Competition compels capitalists to expand endlessly, yet the very process undermines the purchasing power of society. The system collapses under the weight of its own logic. Another contradiction emerges from the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. As capitalists compete, they invest in machinery and technology to increase productivity. While this raises output, it also reduces the proportion of labor in production. Since surplus value comes from labor, not machines, profits tend to decline over time. To counteract this tendency, capitalists drive down wages, cut costs, and expand into new markets. Yet these very measures intensify exploitation and overproduction, setting the stage for deeper crises. Capitalism's contradictions are not limited to economics. They also manifest socially and politically. This system creates unprecedented wealth, but concentrates it in fewer hands, producing extreme inequality. It fosters technological innovation, but applies it in ways that deepen exploitation. It globalizes production, but destabilizes communities, uprooting traditional ways of life. It promises freedom, yet traps individuals in alienating labor and precarious survival. Each advance of capital intensifies tensions that it cannot resolve. These contradictions also have ecological dimensions. Capitalism treats nature as a resource to be exploited for profit. Forests, rivers, and soil are consumed as inputs for production, with little regard for sustainability. Yet ecological destruction eventually undermines production itself. Climate change, pollution, and resource depletion reveal another way in which the logic of endless accumulation collides with the material conditions of life. Marx's insight into capitalism's metabolic rift, the disruption of the relationship between humans and nature, anticipates contemporary ecological crises.
Crises, however, are not merely destructive. For Marx, they are moments of revelation. They expose the fragility of capitalism and the false harmony promoted by ideology. During crises, the contradictions of the system become visible. Workers see that their suffering is not due to personal failure, but systemic instability. Capitalists reveal their ruthlessness, cutting jobs and slashing wages to preserve profits. States intervene to save corporations while neglecting ordinary people, exposing their class character. In these moments, a possibility of transformation becomes tangible. Yet Marx does not claim that crises automatically lead to revolution. They create openings, but outcomes depend on class struggle. Without organization and consciousness, crises can be resolved in ways that restore capital through bailouts, austerity, or war. Only when workers seize these openings with collective action can crises become revolutionary turning points. The philosophy of crisis highlights the dual nature of capitalism. It is both the most dynamic and the most unstable system in history. It has unleashed technological marvels, global networks, and unprecedented productivity, yet it cannot escape the contradictions that drive it toward breakdown. For Marx, the significance of these crises is not merely economic. They reveal that capitalism is not eternal, but historical. Just as feudalism collapsed under its contradictions, so too will capitalism. For Marx, the concept of freedom is central, yet it is often misunderstood if reduced to the liberal notion of individual choice.
Liberalism equates freedom with the absence of external interference, the ability to act without coercion. But Marx saw this as shallow. What good is formal freedom if the material conditions of life render individuals powerless? A worker who is free to sell their labor to any capitalist is still compelled to work in order to survive. Their freedom is constrained by necessity. True freedom, Marx argued, requires transforming the material conditions of life so that people can act according to their own development rather than out of mere survival. Freedom is not just the absence of restraint, but the presence of real capacity. To be free is to have control over the conditions of existence: food, housing, healthcare, education, leisure, and meaningful work. Without these, formal rights are hollow promises. This distinction reflects Marx's broader philosophy of necessity. Human beings are embedded in natural and social conditions. We must eat, sleep, and produce in order to survive. These necessities cannot be abolished. The question then is how societies organize their relationship to necessity. Under capitalism, necessity dominates life. Most people labor not for self-realization, but to meet basic survival needs, while the surplus of society is appropriated by a minority. Freedom for the few rests on necessity for the many. In a socialist society, Marx envisioned, necessity would be collectively managed in ways that reduce its burden. Advances in technology and production would free humanity from endless toil, creating the material basis for freedom. Once necessities are secured for all, people could direct their energies toward higher forms of activity: art, science, philosophy, and communal life. Freedom would emerge not in opposition to necessity, but through its transformation. Marx often invoked the distinction between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. The realm of necessity refers to the labor required to sustain life. The realm of freedom begins where necessity ends, where individuals can pursue activities for their own sake rather than for survival. In capitalist societies, the realm of freedom is restricted to the wealthy minority. The task of communism is to expand it universally. This vision challenges the liberal ideology that capitalism already provides freedom. Marx insisted that capitalism produces a distorted kind of freedom. Workers are free in a dual sense, free from feudal obligations, but also free from ownership of the means of production. This second freedom is a form of dispossession. It forces workers into dependence on capital, turning their freedom into a condition of exploitation. What appears as freedom is in fact compulsion under another name.
This materialist conception of freedom also highlights the interdependence of individuals. Liberal ideology often imagines freedom as independence, the solitary individual free from others. Marx saw freedom as social. Our capacities and desires develop through interaction with others. To be free is not to withdraw from society, but to participate in it under conditions of equality and mutual recognition. Freedom is realized in community, not isolation. The significance of Marx's vision is that it redefines emancipation. Emancipation is not merely the extension of rights within capitalism, but the transformation of the very structure of life. Political emancipation, such as voting rights, is important but limited if economic structures remain untouched. True emancipation requires social revolution, the abolition of private property and the means of production, and the creation of a society where human needs, not profits, guide production. For Marx, then, freedom is not something given by law or granted by rulers. It is the collective outcome of struggle. It emerges when humanity takes conscious control of its social life, no longer dominated by blind market forces or class domination. In this sense, Marx links freedom to historical necessity. Humanity is compelled by necessity to transform society, and in doing so, it opens the possibility of freedom.
The philosophical core of this vision is that freedom is not an abstraction, but a material possibility grounded in human practice. To be free is to live in a society where the realm of necessity is reduced, where alienation is overcome, and where individuals can pursue their development in harmony with others. This is not a utopian dream, but in Marx's analysis, the logical outcome of historical development, once humanity transcends the contradictions of capitalism. At the center of Marx's philosophy is his theory of history, often referred to as historical materialism. It is not a rigid formula, but a way of analyzing human societies through the interaction of material conditions, productive forces, and social relations. Marx wanted to move beyond the speculative philosophies of history that treated historical change as the unfolding of spirit or destiny. Instead, he argued that history must be understood through the concrete realities of human labor, production, and struggle. The foundation of this view is that human beings must produce in order to survive. Production is not only about creating material goods, but about shaping the very conditions of life. From the earliest hunter-gatherer communities to complex industrial societies, the way people produce determines how they live together. The tools available, the forms of cooperation, the division of labor, all these shape social organization. Marx saw history as structured by modes of production. Each mode of production consists of productive forces such as tools, technology, labor power, and relations of production, the social arrangements that govern access to those forces. When productive forces advance, they eventually come into conflict with existing relations of production. This conflict generates crises, struggles, and ultimately transformations in the mode of production. For example, feudalism was built on agricultural labor tied to land ownership. Serfs were bound to lords, and surplus was extracted through direct obligation. As trade expanded, towns grew, and new technologies developed, the feudal relations of production became a barrier. Merchants, artisans, and eventually industrialists challenged the feudal order. Out of this conflict emerged capitalism with its new relations of wage labor, private property, and markets. This analysis reveals history not as random or purely driven by ideas, but as a process shaped by material contradictions. Ideas matter, but they arise within the framework of material conditions. Religion, philosophy, law, and culture are not independent forces floating above society, but expressions of underlying social relations. They are what Marx called the superstructure, resting upon the economic base. The base does not mechanically determine the superstructure, but it sets the limits and pressures within which cultural and ideological forms develop. Central to Marx's method is the dialectic, which he inherited from Hegel but reoriented towards materialism. Hegel's dialectic explained change as the unfolding of contradictions in the realm of ideas. For Marx, contradictions exist in material life. The dialectic is not simply logical, but social. It is the conflict between forces and relations of production, between classes, between needs and existing structures. These contradictions drive history forward.
Class struggle is the motor of history. The history of all hitherto existing society, Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, is the history of class struggles. In every mode of production, there is a dominant class that controls the surplus and a subordinate class that produces it. Their conflict takes different forms, slave and master, lord and serf, capitalist and worker, but the antagonism is fundamental. This struggle does not always erupt in open conflict, but it shapes the development of society at every level. One of the radical implications of this theory is that capitalism itself is not eternal. Just as feudalism once seemed unshakable, yet gave way to capitalism, so too will capitalism contain the seeds of its own transformation.
The contradictions of capitalism between the social character of production and the private appropriation of surplus, between capital and labor, between technological possibility and social inequality, generate crises that point beyond the system. Marx's philosophy of history is not deterministic. He did not believe that socialism would arrive automatically, like the turning of the seasons. History presents possibilities, but their realization depends on human agency. Class struggle is decisive. The working class, by organizing and acting collectively, can transform necessity into freedom. Without struggle, contradictions may persist, or a society may even regress. The dialectic opens possibilities, but does not guarantee outcomes. This historical materialism provides a lens for analyzing not only the past, but the present. It allows us to see capitalism not as a natural order, but as a historical form. Its laws of motion are specific, not universal. By situating capitalism within history, Marx undermines the ideology that presents it as the final stage of human development. Another philosophical dimension of this theory is its rejection of teleology. Marx did not see history as unfolding toward a predetermined end. He criticized those who imagined communism as a blueprint outside of history. Instead, communism emerges imminently from the contradictions of capitalism. It is not an abstract ideal imposed on reality, but the practical resolution of real conflicts. Marx's materialism thus unites philosophy with science and practice. It explains history not by appealing to divine will or abstract principles, but through the concrete dynamics of social life. At the same time, it does not reduce individuals to passive products of conditions. Human beings make history, but they do so under circumstances not of their own choosing. The task of philosophy is to understand these circumstances and to help illuminate the paths of transformation. In this way, Marx's theory of history is both descriptive and normative. It describes how societies change, but it also carries the implicit claim that emancipation is possible. If history is shaped by struggle, then history can also be shaped toward freedom. The recognition of this possibility is itself a form of power, a way of breaking the illusion that existing conditions are immutable. A central part of Marx's philosophy is his analysis of ideology. For Marx, ideology is not merely a set of false beliefs, but a system of ideas, institutions, and cultural practices that mask the reality of social relations. It works to naturalize and legitimize the existing order, making domination appear inevitable and just. Ideology does not simply deceive individuals in a crude way, but shapes the very categories through which they perceive the world. Capitalist society produces ideology as a necessary counterpart to its economic structure. Just as production organizes material life, ideology organizes consciousness. Legal systems, religious institutions, education, media, and art are not neutral, but reflect the interests of the ruling class. This is why Marx and Engels declared that the ruling ideas of every age have ever been the ideas of the ruling class. Those who control material production also control the production of ideas.
This mystification extends beyond economics. Political rights, such as freedom of speech or the right to vote, are celebrated as signs of universal liberty, yet they exist within a framework that preserves economic domination. Workers may be politically free, but remain economically dependent on capitalists for survival. This creates what Marx called formal freedom, a freedom that masks deeper unfreedom. Ideology ensures that individuals focus on the formal dimension while ignoring the structural inequalities beneath it. Religion, in Marx's analysis, plays a particularly important role in this ideological structure. He famously described it as the opium of the people, a phrase often misunderstood as mere dismissal. For Marx, religion provides comfort in a world of suffering,
offering meaning in conditions of alienation. It dulls pain, but also prevents people from confronting the social causes of their misery. By promising salvation in another world, religion diverts attention from injustice in this one. In this sense, it both expresses real suffering and sustains the conditions that cause it. Education and culture also serve ideological functions. Schools teach skills necessary for labor, but they also transmit values of obedience, competition, and individualism that align with capitalist needs. Literature, philosophy, and art are shaped by material conditions, though not in a mechanical way. They can reproduce dominant ideology, but they can also contain contradictions, expressing dissent or revealing truths about social life. Marx recognized that culture is a contested space where ruling ideas dominate, but resistance is always possible. The role of ideology in shaping consciousness is critical. People do not automatically recognize their exploitation. They may see their struggles as personal misfortune or attribute poverty to laziness rather than systemic inequality. This false consciousness, as later Marxists called it, keeps workers from uniting against capital. Ideology ensures that the dominated participate in their own domination by accepting the world as natural and unchangeable. Yet consciousness is not fixed. Material conditions, especially crises, can destabilize ideology. When unemployment rises, when wages fall, when social promises are broken, individuals begin to question the narratives they have been taught. Contradictions between ideology and lived reality create cracks through which critical consciousness can emerge. Class consciousness develops when workers recognize their shared position and collective interests, moving beyond individual struggles to see themselves as a class in conflict with capital. Marx's analysis of ideology has profound implications. It shows that the battle for emancipation is not only economic, but also cultural and intellectual. Overcoming exploitation requires not only organizing production differently, but also dismantling the ideas and institutions that justify inequality. Revolution is as much about transforming consciousness as it is about seizing factories. This is why Marx placed such importance on critique. Philosophy, he argued, must unmask illusions and reveal the material foundations of ideology. The task of critique is not to judge ideas in the abstract, but to show how they are rooted in social relations. By exposing the contradictions between ideology and reality, critique helps prepare the ground for change. The concept of ideology also guards against simplistic understandings of freedom. It reminds us that what people believe to be free choice may be shaped by hidden structures. It challenges the notion that markets, laws, or culture are neutral arenas, instead showing how they reproduce class power. At the same time, it opens the possibility of resistance. If ideology is historically produced, it can also be challenged and transformed. Thus, Marx's theory of ideology is not a counsel of despair, but a call to vigilance. It urges us to look beneath appearances, to question the narratives that sustain inequality, and to recognize the power of culture in both maintaining and resisting domination. In a world saturated with media, advertising, and consumer culture, this aspect of Marx's thought is perhaps more relevant than ever before.
Human beings, Marx argued, are essentially species beings. This term emphasizes that humans differ from animals not only by biological capacity, but by their ability to consciously shape the world through labor. Labor, in its essence, is creative, purposeful, and social. It is through work that humans express their capacities, transform nature,
and build communities. Labor is the activity through which humans realize their essence. Under capitalism, however, labor is not free and self-expressive, but coerced and alienated. Workers do not control the conditions of their labor or the products they create. Instead, their labor is sold as a commodity to survive. The activity that should be the highest expression of human potential becomes external to the worker, a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Work becomes exhausting, repetitive, and degrading, severing the individual from their own creative powers. Alienation takes several forms. First, workers are alienated from the product of their labor. What they produce does not belong to them, but to the capitalist. The objects they create confront them as alien powers. A factory worker may assemble goods that are sold for profit, yet cannot afford them. A software engineer may write code that enriches corporations while receiving only a fraction of its value. The products of labor become hostile, embodying the domination of capital over the worker. Second, workers are alienated from the labor process itself. Labor is not freely chosen or intrinsically satisfying, but dictated by the needs of capital. Tasks are specialized, repetitive, and controlled by management. Workers become cogs in a machine, their activity reduced to following instructions. The very act of working, which should be the means of realizing human creativity, becomes something to endure, a burden that exhausts rather than fulfills. Third, alienation estranges workers from their own species being. Since humans realize themselves through free, creative labor, the reduction of work to mere survival severs them from their essence. Instead of shaping the world consciously, workers are dominated by forces they cannot control. Their potential remains unrealized, their humanity diminished. Alienation, in this sense, is a loss of human flourishing. Fourth, alienation extends to social relations. Capitalism pits individuals against one another in competition. Workers compete for jobs, wages, and promotions. The market frames relations in terms of exchange value rather than genuine connection. Instead of community, individuals encounter each other as rivals or as buyers and sellers. This corrodes solidarity and reduces human bonds to economic transactions. Alienation is not limited to workers. Capitalists, too, are caught in its logic. Though they command wealth, they are compelled by the relentless drive to accumulate capital. Their lives are dominated by profit, competition, and fear of loss. They cannot escape the imperatives of the system. In this way, alienation is a condition of the whole society, though it weighs most heavily on workers. What makes Marx's analysis profound is that he does not treat alienation as a timeless human condition. It is specific to certain historical arrangements, particularly capitalism. Alienation arises because labor and its products are subordinated to private property and capital accumulation. In other words, it is a social, not natural phenomenon. This means it can be overcome by transforming the conditions of production. The abolition of private property and the collective ownership of the means of production would, in Marx's view, end alienation by allowing labor to become free and creative again. Under communism, work would no longer be a coerced necessity, but an expression of human potential. Individuals would engage in activities that develop their capacities while contributing to the community. The division between work and life, production and freedom, would dissolve. The concept of alienation also resonates beyond the workplace. Modern experiences of consumerism, bureaucracy, and technology often reproduce feelings of estrangement. People may feel disconnected from the products they consume, from political institutions that appear remote, or from natural environments that are commodified. Marx's theory of alienation provides a framework for understanding these experiences as rooted in social structures rather than personal failure. This idea has inspired many later thinkers, from existentialists to critical theorists, who extended the concept of alienation to cultural, psychological, and ecological dimensions. Yet, at its core, Marx's insight remains simple and radical. Alienation is not inevitable. It is the result of social arrangements that can be changed. To overcome alienation is to reclaim humanity itself, to transform labor from drudgery into creativity, and to reshape society around the full development of human beings.
Marx's philosophy does not stop at analysis. It is a call to action, a theory meant to be realized through practice. The ultimate aim is not to interpret the world, but to change it. Revolution is the mechanism through which alienation, exploitation, and inequality can be overcome. It is not merely a political event, but a profound transformation of social relations, a leap from one mode of production to another, from necessity to freedom. For Marx, revolution arises from the contradictions of capitalism itself. The system expands productivity, but simultaneously deepens exploitation. It produces wealth on an unimaginable scale, but concentrates it in the hands of a few. It creates a global working class bound together by networks of production, yet this very class is denied the fruits of its labor. These contradictions cannot be permanently resolved within capitalism. They generate crises and struggles that point toward revolution. Revolution, however, is not automatic. It depends on class consciousness and collective organization. Workers must recognize that their struggles are not isolated, but part of a common condition. They must unite across divisions of trade, nation, and identity to confront capital as a class. This requires institutions of solidarity, unions, parties, movements that can coordinate struggle and articulate visions of transformation. The process of revolution involves more than seizing political power. It demands the restructuring of the economic base. Without transforming property relations, political victories remain fragile. Marx saw the abolition of private ownership of the means of production as central. Factories, land, and resources must be collectively controlled to ensure that production serves social needs rather than private profit. This is not merely redistribution, but the creation of a new mode of production. Human emancipation in this framework goes beyond political emancipation. Political rights under capitalism, freedom of speech, assembly, voting, are valuable but limited. They operate within a system of economic dependence that keeps workers subordinated. Only when material conditions are transformed can political rights become genuine rather than formal. Marx envisioned communism not as a rigid blueprint, but as the practical resolution of contradictions. He resisted utopian schemes that prescribed the details of a perfect society. Instead, he emphasized the principles that must guide emancipation: the end of class domination, the abolition of alienated labor, the collective ownership of productive forces, and the development of human capacities. Communism is not an ideal imposed from outside history, but the imminent result of struggles within it. Revolution, for Marx, is also a process of human development. It is not only about new institutions, but about new forms of life. When workers take control of production, they cease to be passive victims of circumstances and become active shapers of history. This transformation of conditions is simultaneously a transformation of consciousness. Emancipation is thus both material and spiritual, reshaping not only society, but human beings themselves. The idea of revolution raises questions of violence and force. Marx recognized that ruling classes do not surrender power voluntarily. The state, with its police and military, exists to protect existing property relations. Revolution may therefore require confrontation with these forces. Yet Marx did not glorify violence. He saw it as a means forced upon the oppressed by the structures of domination. The goal of revolution is not destruction for its own sake, but the creation of a society where force is no longer necessary to secure justice. A critical dimension of Marx's conception of revolution is internationalism. Capitalism is a global system, extending across borders through trade, finance, and production. The working class is also international, bound together by common conditions. For this reason, Marx argued that workers of the world must unite. National struggles are important, but without international solidarity, victories can be isolated and reversed. Revolution must expand beyond borders to dismantle the global structures of capital. Human emancipation is the horizon of this struggle. It means the full development of human capacities, freed from the constraints of alienated labor and oppressive structures. In a society without class domination, individuals would not be forced into narrow roles, but would develop multiple talents. The division between intellectual and manual labor, between necessity and leisure, would erode. Freedom would no longer be the privilege of a few, but the condition of all.
This vision of emancipation is not abstract. It emerges directly from the realities of capitalism. The productive forces developed under capitalism, technology, science, global cooperation, already contain the possibility of abundance. The obstacle is not scarcity, but the relations of production that channel wealth into private profit. By reorganizing these forces collectively, society could provide for all while reducing the burden of labor. Freedom becomes possible not by escaping history, but by realizing the potential already embedded within it. In this sense, Marx's philosophy of revolution is both radical and practical. It calls for the overthrow of existing structures, but bases this call on a sober analysis of contradictions. It is utopian in its horizon of human emancipation, but grounded in the realities of struggle. It insists that liberation is not a gift from above, but the work of the oppressed themselves. Revolution, then, is the culmination of Marx's thought. It ties together his analysis of exploitation, alienation, ideology, and history. It is the moment where philosophy and practice converge, where critique becomes action. And it is the point at which humanity, for the first time, can consciously shape its destiny rather than being driven by blind forces. For Marx, communism is not a utopia constructed in imagination, but the real movement that abolishes the present state of things. It is the horizon that emerges from the contradictions of capitalism and the struggles of the working class. Communism is not an abstract scheme to be imposed, but a form of life born out of necessity and possibility, rooted in the actual development of society. At its core, communism means the abolition of private property in the means of production. This does not refer to personal possessions, clothing, homes, or tools, but to the property that enables one class to dominate another. Factories, land, and resources are the foundation of social power. So long as they remain privately owned, exploitation continues. Collectivizing these means of production removes the structural basis of class domination and allows wealth to be organized for common use. Communism also dissolves the distinction between labor and freedom. Under capitalism, work is alienated, performed as a necessity for survival. Freedom is relegated to leisure time, separated from the activity that occupies most of life. In a communist society, labor would become free and creative, an activity chosen not out of coercion, but as an expression of human potential. The separation between work and life would erode,
and individuals would find fulfillment in contributing to collective well-being. Another central principle is distribution according to need. Capitalism distributes resources based on market exchange and profitability, leaving some with abundance while others suffer deprivation. Communism recognizes that human beings have diverse needs and capacities. Its guiding principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, expresses the idea that society should ensure the flourishing of all rather than reward accumulation. This principle emerges not from moral idealism, but from the material possibility created by modern production. Freedom, in Marx's view, does not mean mere absence of restraint. True freedom arises when individuals collectively control the conditions of their lives. It is realized when necessity is mastered, when survival is secured, and when people can develop themselves without being subordinated to alien forces. Communism expands freedom by liberating individuals from dependence on wage labor, from fear of poverty, and from subjection to markets. It creates the space for people to cultivate their talents, pursue education, participate in culture, and engage in community. Communism also transforms social relations. In capitalist society, relations are mediated by money and commodities. People encounter each other as buyers and sellers, employers and employees, competitors in the marketplace. Under communism, these economic roles would dissolve. Relations would be direct, grounded in cooperation and mutual recognition rather than exchange. Community would no longer be fragmented by competition, but strengthened by shared responsibility.
Communism also addresses the alienation between humanity and nature. Capitalism treats nature as an object to be exploited endlessly, leading to ecological destruction. In communism, by contrast, production would be organized consciously, balancing human needs with ecological sustainability. Humans would recognize themselves as part of nature, not its master. Marx's concept of the metabolic rift, the disruption of the natural cycles caused by capitalist production, suggests that overcoming capitalism is essential to restoring harmony with the environment. The road to communism is not linear. Marx insisted that socialism and communism cannot be achieved through gradual reforms within capitalism alone. While reforms may improve conditions, they do not alter the underlying structures of exploitation. Genuine transformation requires a break with the logic of capital, a revolution in property relations, and a reorganization of society at its foundation. Communism is not a policy, but a new mode of production. Marx's conception of communism also carries an epistemological dimension. Under capitalism, human consciousness is shaped by ideology, obscuring the reality of exploitation. In communism, when class domination ends, ideology loses its foundation. Consciousness can become more transparent, aligned with reality, rather than distorted by ruling class interests. Human beings can relate to themselves, to each other, and to the world without the veil of mystification. Communism, therefore, is the culmination of Marx's philosophy of freedom, history, and human development. It is the resolution of alienation, the realization of species being, and the opening of history to conscious self-determination. It does not promise paradise or perfection, but offers the possibility of building a society where human capacities can be fully developed. Marx understood that communism would not appear overnight, nor would it be free of challenges. But he argued that the contradictions of capitalism make it both necessary and possible.
The choice humanity faces is not between communism and continuation of the status quo, but between communism and the collapse of civilization under the weight of its own contradictions. In this sense, communism is not only desirable, but urgent. The ideas of Karl Marx have extended far beyond his own time, shaping political movements, intellectual debates, and social struggles for more than a century and a half. His philosophy remains alive not simply because of his historical influence, but because the contradictions he described in Capitalism persist in the present. To study Marx today is not to examine a relic of the past, but to engage with a framework that continues to illuminate the conditions of our world. One of the enduring aspects of Marx's legacy is his critique of inequality. Capitalism, he argued, generates vast disparities of wealth and power because it is built upon exploitation. Workers produce value, but ownership of the means of production allows capitalists to capture the surplus. This mechanism has not disappeared. In fact, modern capitalism has intensified it. The rise of billionaires, global corporations, and financial markets that dominate entire economies demonstrates the same pattern Marx identified in the 19th century. His analysis of exploitation remains a vital tool for understanding why wealth concentrates in the hands of a few, while poverty afflicts many. Another aspect of Marx's relevance lies in his theory of crises. He showed that capitalism is inherently unstable, prone to cycles of boom and bust. These crises are not accidental, but structural, emerging from contradictions between production and consumption, profit and wages, investment and demand. The global financial crisis of 2008 provided a dramatic illustration. Speculative bubbles, excessive debt, and overproduction led to a collapse that reverberated worldwide. Marx's insight that capitalism creates its own crises by its very logic proved once again prophetic. Marx also provides a lens for understanding globalization. In the Communist Manifesto, he wrote that the bourgeoisie compels all nations to adopt capitalist forms of production, drawing them into a world market. Today, multinational corporations, global supply chains, and digital networks reflect this process on an unprecedented scale. Labor in one country produces goods for another. Financial flows move across continents in seconds. Cultural forms are shared worldwide. Yet this globalization also spreads inequality, relocates exploitation, and intensifies environmental pressures. Marx's framework reveals how global integration is driven not by neutral progress, but by the imperatives of capital.
The ecological crisis of our time also draws attention back to Marx's thought. His concept of the metabolic rift, the disruption of the natural cycles by capitalist production, resonates powerfully in an era of climate change, deforestation, and mass extinction. Marx understood that capitalism exhausts not only workers, but also the earth, treating nature as an inexhaustible reservoir for profit. Contemporary ecological Marxism develops this insight, arguing that overcoming capitalism is essential to restoring balance between humanity and the planet. Marx's legacy is also evident in debates about labor. The gig economy, with its precarious jobs and lack of protections, shows the continuing relevance of his concept of alienation. Workers today often find themselves fragmented, isolated, and deprived of stability. The promise of flexibility conceals the reality of exploitation. Marx's analysis explains why technological advances that could free humanity from toil instead deepen insecurity. Under capitalism, technology serves capital, not people. Culturally, Marx's ideas have shaped fields from sociology to literature, from anthropology to critical theory. Thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, Louis Althusser, Herbert Marcuse, and Raymond Williams extended his insights into ideology, culture, and hegemony. Movements such as feminism, post-colonial theory, and critical race studies have engaged with Marx, sometimes critiquing his limitations, but also building upon his structural analysis of power. His philosophy has proven fertile ground for rethinking domination in all its forms. Politically, Marx inspired revolutions and movements across the globe. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and countless anti-colonial struggles drew upon Marx's ideas. These historical experiences were complex, sometimes marked by authoritarianism and distortion, but they testified to the power of Marx's vision to mobilize masses. Even where revolutions faltered, Marx's language of class struggle gave voice to aspirations for justice and equality. In contemporary movements, Marxist thought continues to echo. Workers' organizations, environmental activists, anti-austerity campaigns, and movements for racial justice often draw upon Marx's frameworks, even if indirectly. The language of the 99% versus the 1% popularized during the Occupy movement reflects Marx's analysis of class antagonism. Demands for universal health care, free education, and climate justice align with the principle of organizing production for human needs rather than profit. Marx's relevance is not limited to the political left. Even critics of socialism often acknowledge the accuracy of his descriptions of capitalism's tendencies. Economists and policymakers analyze inequality, financial crises, and globalization in ways that echo Marx's insights, sometimes without naming him. His work remains part of the intellectual fabric of modern society, a reference point for understanding how economies and societies function. Importantly, Marx's philosophy offers not just critique, but hope. His insistence that history is shaped by human activity, that structures can be changed through collective struggle, and that freedom is possible beyond exploitation provides a vision that continues to inspire. In a world where despair and cynicism often dominate, Marx's conviction that another form of life is both necessary and achievable reminds us that history is open, not closed. The persistence of capitalism's contradictions ensures that Marxist thought will remain relevant. As long as exploitation, inequality, and ecological destruction endure, the need for a philosophy that explains and challenges them will continue. Marx's work is not complete, nor does it provide ready-made answers, but it offers a foundation for critical reflection and transformative action.